We are very fortunate, and I'm personally very excited to have Dr. Shameka Poetry Thomas with us, who is a medical sociologist and reproductive health equity scientist. Dr. Thomas is currently an intramural postdoctoral fellow at the NIH in the National Human Genomics Research Institute, NHGRI, in the Health Disparities Unit of the Social Behavioral Research Branch. She focuses on patient perceptions of non-invasive prenatal testing among Black women with genetic conditions such as sickle cell disease. And today she's going to be talking with us about cultivating diversity as an ethos with an anti-racism approach in the scientific enterprise. The recent paper that came out in Human Genomics Advances, which came out with the announcement, and I'll add it in the chat as well for those who didn't get a chance to look at it in advance. But I'm really hoping that we'll have a rich discussion after Dr. Thomas gives us the first presentation component of her talk. So welcome, and please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. How's everyone doing? Can you hear me, see me? Can I get a few thumbs up? Great. Okay. I'm going to open the chat because I do want to use some questions. So let's see. Okay. All right. So this will be just, just the mini lecture series. And of course, we'll have a Q&A or open format discussion toward the end. So I'll share my screen. Can everybody see? Okay. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful opportunity to speak with you today regarding our lab's article. I had the honor to work with our lab and our team to build this project and see it to fruition in publication, and it's reached wide coverage. And so we're really grateful for this opportunity here. So without further ado, I'll be presenting largely on the article, and I do have some hidden slides at the end if we want to talk more about examples of my research or other topics going forward. First and foremost, I do want to pose a dedication to Women's History Month. It is March, can you believe it? And here's a photo of Naomi Campbell and her amazing, beautiful daughter. She just gave birth. I am a maternal health scholar. Maternal health, reproductive scientist, reproductive health scientist. So you'll see some photos or imagery throughout this particular presentation that speaks to my research and to my generation, that speaks to how there's a lot of, let's say, images of Black women that I would like to kind of shift narratives from pejorative images toward more positive images of women in the media. So I do want to give a dedication to Women's History Month, and to all of the persons on this call who identify as women. I see you, I value you, and I thank you for your energy and presence. All right, so just a quick roadmap. I'll give a presentation of the article. Also, I'll post some reflection or rhetorical questions, and then of course, we'll have a discussion Q&A open format. So as you know, this article was published in NHGRI Advances, and you see here that we have, you all have the article, you've all been given the questions as well as the model, but I just kind of wanted to throw this back out there in case you needed to see the citation once more, but we'll discuss this going forward. And you also have the questions that are broken up into two formats. We have the structural interrogation and then the personal reflection. And I'll bring up two particular questions in mind toward the end. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about what got us to this point and what got our lab to this point and what got me on this trajectory to think critically about what does it mean to have an ethos. And I highlight three particular books and references, and their photos are here in case you want to maybe dive in or kind of reread some of these topics or include them on syllabi in your programs. But one book that really stood out to me along the way of my own trajectory was Medical Apartheid. And Harriet Washington does a really stellar job of trying to understand the dark history of the medical infrastructure and the medical structure. And as a medical sociologist, seeing the merge between the structure and biomedicine, as well as clinical processes, as well as the social, and how these are integrated. These are not systems that operate in a vacuum, but they inform each other and they are betwixt in between. So often I see myself as this hybrid scholar who is someone who understands maybe a little bit more about the social aspects, but it is not removed from the clinical and the health domain and the health sciences as well. And so these books kind of help expand my mind and thinking critically and more engaging about health and what does this mean in genomics, as well as the society and how we integrate these perceptions. So Cass, we reread this as a lab in our group, and it talked a little bit about caste systems, or actually a lot about caste systems, but particularly caste systems around the world and how these origins and these social and historical foundations are integrated and woven into today's present day society, and how it also perpetuates persistent health disparities. We also read Dana Matthews' book on just medicine, and she offers several different models on the implicit bias and implicit biases, as well as explicit biases, and how patient perceptions are also kind of sort of a collection of how they experience the clinical encounter. So these particular books kind of started my brainwaves on thinking about ethos. So as I was thinking about this talk and trying to figure out how to wrap this into a lecture format, I wanted to start with this photo. Now, what do you see here? It's a beach, right? I am from Miami, Florida, so I grew up around water. I grew up around beaches. I grew up around, you know, the South Floridian Caribbean vibration. So shout out to anyone who lives on the West Coast and they're close to the Pacific Ocean and you understand my sentiments here. But what do we know about beaches, and what does this have to do with an ethos? You might just see, you know, a regular picture here, but to me, this looks like the surface. A beach represents something that we, you know, find pretty, quote unquote, with something that we find that is like the illusion of something. We go to beaches to have a good time, to decompress, to relax, but we also know that the beach is not the reality. The beach is a surface. The beach is pretty, it is an illusion. So when we think about going to the beach, or we think about going to a campus or coming to a lab, we see the surface, we see what's pretty on the outside, we see the hiring package, we maybe see, you know, who's hired on the surface, what's been happening along the way of the campus or the organization or the institution. But we also know that we cannot see what's below the surface. We also know that the surface is not the reality. And so this kind of kickstarts my brain into thinking, how do I translate what an ethos is to a team of colleagues and a team of scientists? I have to really tell you that it is about diving below the surface. It is about going underneath the surface, going underneath the structure to really understand what is happening in this organization, what is happening in this institution, what is happening in this lab that has been historically happened over time, and how can we alleviate these patterns? So ethos in this sense, and I draw a lot from the article, of course, is historical. It is persistent. And these do not operate in a vacuum, but they inform each other and they're integrated throughout time, space, and context. And a stark example of this is the ideology of race, right? And this concept is fundamental and foundational to the field of genetics and genomics, as it was used to separate human species into racial categories, and values were assigned to those categories based on biological differences of superiority and inferiority. So we have examples of this, such as eugenics, or xenophobic attacks, police brutality, and even persistent health disparity and health outcomes over time and space. And so I offer also just a translational definition of what this means, that ethos is generated by collection. It is a collection of the inward and outward. It is a combination of the surface, that beach, and the structure, the ocean, was beneath the surface. So just a quick example here, this photo, at the top, you see the iceberg, right? What happened, or what happens, the event. that maybe happen in a lab or happen in a campus or happen on a campus. Then just below that, you see what continues to happen, the patterns, the social patterns, or the patterns that perpetuate these events or how we respond to these events. And just below the surface, actually deep within, you see the structures. This represents, in what I would call as a medical sociologist in my training, an institution's transcript. We all see those transcripts from school where you actually see the collection of your grades over time, but an institution also has a transcript. And these transcripts are historical lineages that follow the institutions. They follow the memory of the people who have been in and out of those institutions, whether hired, fired, moved on, or let go. The institution has a memory. It has a structure. And in that structure, beneath the surface, what causes these patterns to be maintained? What causes these patterns to be maintained over time, over space, and throughout context? And this kind of gives a microcosm or some type of image of what it means of an ethos at the structural level. Here's another idea to just kind of give you some imagery here. So a lot of times we talk about cultural competency, and we have these cultural competency training programs or cultural competency training platforms that try to get at some type of idea of diversity or implicit bias training, etc. But these are all, according to this image, is a very surface touch point. Just beneath this, you have these systems of oppression that are beneath the surface, deep into the waters, right, of the society, deep into the waters of the institution, and shown within the fabric of the institution. These are symbolic, but just because we're talking about structural racism, we have to remember that individuals make up the structure. So at the heart of the institution, at the heart of the structure, is the individual. And a lot of my research focuses on individual level perceptions, such as patient perceptions, such as micro level of analyses that get at the heart of an institution and how the top-down approach impacts how someone experiences the lived experience of that institution. So in order to even think about ethos at this very granular level, and to expand our thinking on diversity, we have to talk about what ethos is not. And in the article, my colleagues and I, we posed these different tenets that focus on what ethos is not. And the one thing to remember is in regards to ethos, it is not about the numbers. It is not about reaching quotas. This is an expanded version away from how many people did we hire in this institution, how many people do we hire in this lab, how many people of this particular color, creed, background is in this classroom. It's not necessarily about the numbers. This ethos that we're talking about is about the spirit of the institution, the character of the institution, the atmosphere of the institution. Ethos is also not about giving favors to minoritized individuals. It's not an act of benevolence. And there are some scholars who even discuss how framing this as an act of benevolence also is a deliberate act of implicit bias and microaggressive behavior. So saying that, we hired one person of this particular background, round of applause, but that's not what gets at expanding our notion of diversity toward an ethos. And diversity as an ethos is also not about a single attempt. It's not a one-time stab in the dark or one-time stab toward getting to where we want to be as an organization or where we want to be in the cultural presence of this institution. Rather, diversity as an ethos in this particular framework is about value. It's about what we value gets prioritized. It is about value and priorities. And a lot of times those are numerical values in the terms of monetized amounts, funding, but also value in the sense of, do we actually listen and hold space? Do we actually see and hear? Do we actually take time to educate and interrogate our own level of lived experiences so that we're not, stepping on people's toes or devaluing the scientists that we work with around in our workforce? Cultivating diversity as an ethos is also about innovation and expansion. One thing that has drawn me to science is that it's the idea that I can invent something or expand on something that has never been done before. I pursued my PhD because it gave me something to discover. I enjoy the art of discovery. I enjoy staying in the lab for hours trying to find something that no one else probably believed in right away, except me. And so what led me to science is that drive for expansion, that drive that we don't have to leave things the same way they are every day, that we can actually connect the dots and expand and innovate and create new discoveries that will help people all around the world. So the very thing that has led a lot of us, even those of you at ClinGen, to science is the very thing that we need to expand toward ethos. And this is about reckoning with those structural isms. And this is an ongoing process. This is not a single attempt. This is not a one-time step. This is not based on quarters, but these are ongoing processes within ourselves, within our labs, within our teams, and across the platform of the structure. This, in essence, is like a social climate change. We know we're all impacted by climate change in various different facets out there on the West Coast, out here, where I'm from in Florida, all over the world, we're impacted by climate change, but structures and institutions also have a social climate. And ethos gets at the heart of what that means at the institutional level, that we are all impacted, whether we decide to engage with diversity, whether we decide to engage with equity, whether we decide to recognize and value these priorities over others, or et cetera, we're all impacted by it. And it's only going to continue to grow if we don't acknowledge it and prioritize it. And these are social aspects that do impact how we do genetics and genomics, precision medicine, and health disparities research across the board. And so I offer this approach, anti-racism, to help cultivate this ethos experience. But in order to really understand what an anti-racism approach offers in the first place, we have to really understand what racism is. And so what is racism, right? I mean, there's so many various different definitions, connotations, et cetera. But we draw from a group of social scientists across the board who have helped us pin this down. And you see the references in the article, that racism is interwoven, right? It is a hierarchical system used to organize structures and opportunities based on the values assigned, keyword values, including nationality, ethnicity, phenotype, or other markers of social difference, and how these values are socially interpreted over time. It is also something to say that racism and race are not the same thing. Just because we're studying race as a variable, as a part of our experiment, as a part of our study, it doesn't mean that we're approaching this with an anti-racism approach. These require two different parts of ourselves to really kind of help us really understand what we're doing in our research, in the methodology and the tools that we're using, who we're hiring to do these tools and perform these methods. Are we really engaging with the communities that we serve and disseminating the research in ways that minoritized communities can access this research? So when we talk about an anti-racism approach, just because we study race does not mean we're approaching it from a place of anti-racism. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're cultivating an ethos about the research. If we are to really understand what this means, we have to recognize that racism must be acknowledged if it is to be changed, because it has real consequences. So my approach on anti-racism centers isms. And these are just some examples, right? Because there have been times over time and across different presentations, even before the article, we wrote the article, people say, well, what about gender, or what about socioeconomic status? And my approach on anti-racism does not exclude those isms. Rather, it centers isms. Gendered racism is real. Example, trans people experience racism. We have persons with genetic conditions who experience racism. There's class-based racism across residential segregation, et cetera. Disableism, or I like to say differently abled persons, also experience racism. So when we talk about an anti-racism approach, it's not an and or. It is not like a variable where we say, oh, let's have a race variable, or let's have a SES variable, or an insurance variable as a proxy for SES. Rather, anti-racism is more of a both and. It's deeply intersectional. It centers isms across the board. We have to realize that in our research, regardless of the variables that we're trained to kind of fundamentally study in a quantitative study, or in how we approach our research, people who are actually conducting the study on a team could very well be experiencing racism, even in a lab among fellow lab mates. So when we talk about an anti-racism approach, it is inclusive of how people experience research, the research process, and the research experience. And so we offer 3 tenets on this anti-racism approach. One, it is intentional. It is about intentionality. It is a deliberate act of the researcher to say, I want to learn or expand my thinking or expand my framework on anti-racism approaches in my research, on my team, within myself, and within my lab. This is a critical introspection that is ongoing, and it requires being willing to sit with discomfort. It's a willingness. And I highlight willingly because without that word, we're missing something. If I was to just extract the word willingly and just say sit with discomfort, we won't really get the fullness of what that means. But willingly means that there's something within you where you're saying to yourself, I'm willing to do my part. Even showing up to a talk such as this, actually going above and beyond to critically expand our thought, our syllabi, who we cite in research, who we hire, who we, decide to give platforms to speak and talk. Are we allowing these scientists to be themselves when they're there? Are we willing to sit with the discomfort when people don't always agree with our perspectives? And so an anti-racism approach permits us to name what we're experiencing, confront it, own it, and to embrace diversity as an ethos. What does this all mean? What does this sitting with the discomfort mean? All right, so I'm gonna tell you, I am a certified yoga instructor. And one of the approaches that I have in teaching yoga is that yoga is not about flexibility. Yoga, in my opinion, is about honesty. And sometimes that means being willing to sit with the discomfort within yourself, not ignoring what you're experiencing, but to embrace what you're experiencing. So yes, this is a photo of me in Middle Georgia, where my family is from. my grandparents, and I'm actually facing a cotton field. So after I completed my PhD, I wanted to do a road trip of my own grandparents' lineage. And I went to the spots where they actually plow fields. And when I saw this field, the guide that we were with said, this is the field where your grandmother, your grandparents actually worked on this farm. And so I just got out and I just sat there, I stood in front of it for quite some time. And it was very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable in all of my education to kind of go to a place that was very hard to sit with as a Black female scientist. But I sat with that discomfort, not to ignore it, but to embrace it. And I share this photo with you because I know it is uncomfortable for several people on this call as well. And you may have photos of your own in your own lineage and your own families and your own lived experiences. But when we talk about anti-racism, it is sitting with the discomfort to know that these experiences are real and they do exist. And they impact how we do science, how we show up in science, and how we hold space for other scientists that we're working with in the workforce. So I'll offer another example to kind of bring this home. And you know, biology 101, what is this, right? A nucleus. Like, what does this have to do with the structure or society? What does this have to do with an institution? I'm not here to give a lecture on biology or genetics, but the nucleus is something that is so powerful, even in a cell. And some of my favorite classes along the way have been biology classes, also physics, you know, anatomy classes along the way. But one thing about a cell that I've been able to kind of pair with the structure of a society is that we have this nucleus that contains the information of the DNA, right? It contains and controls the processes of the cell. And what does this have to do with structural racism, right? Well, if you really think about it, we are all cells. Based on the Socio-Ecological Model in sociology, the individual, you see at the bottom here, is like a nucleus. The individual has attitudes, has beliefs, has perceptions, has a knowledge, has a memory, has a behavior pattern that they exude, and it is impacted by the structure around them, the structures around them, the systems at play. So when we talk about structural racism and we maybe, you know, add it to a study or add it to an article or to a research project, what do we really mean when we say structural racism or interrogating structures and systems? In my belief, it is, and not just my belief, but also according to the research, is inherently dealing with the interpersonal and the individual as at the heartbeat of the structure. How can we really interrogate or reckon with these isms across the gamut in the structure if we're not willing to challenge what happens at the individual level? How are we all impacted by what goes on in an institution and how we perceive and negotiate and navigate these experiences from the top down and how they continue to be perpetuated over time and space? So in this particular framework, the individual must, if they're to adopt an anti-racism approach, the individual takes a deliberate act to be introspective, reflective. And this is an inward process. This is something we all must do. This is something we all must do in how we show up to the workforce. And I offer some quick questions here, right? You feel free to, you know, jot down these questions or maybe use these as a kickstart to come up with some for yourself in your lab groups. But think about it. Maybe go back to freshman year or even go back to last year or a class you took recently. Who or what was on the syllabus? Do you remember who you cite, or how often do you cite these particular authors? Who are they? What do they look like? What do they research? What are their values? Who do you not cite? Who do you provide unprecedented mentorship? What do they look like? Where are they from? What are their backgrounds? And when I say they were unprecedented, because we all offer mentorship along various different pipelines. Even a postdoc can mentor a postbac, or a postbac mentors, a research assistant in a lab who's a first-year student. We all are mentoring someone at some level. But who do you offer your unprecedented mentorship to? This is like the quality of your mentorship to this person, the time and energy you take to cultivate and groom this person to reach a level where they can be competitive or apply to programs that make them stellar or stand out. So these are just some individual level questions that get at the nucleus again, or get at the heartbeat of the individual introspection. And these are ongoing self-evaluations. They're not like a check-in where I do this once a year with myself and we're done, but these are ongoing. They're ongoing in a way where we're so embracing of what makes us uncomfortable that we have to do them often. And that's how critical and that's how necessary they are to this ongoing process. So for example, we were cited in the Hill, and Dr. Eric Green, he wrote this, he was interviewed in the Hill, and these are some of his sentiments about this article that our lab wrote. And he said those words can be hard words for people who consider themselves allies to the causes of anti-racism and diversity. But as she notes, I believe he's talking about myself, but as she notes, that discomfort is necessary for progress. As a white man, I am willing to embrace my own discomfort to help create change. And so we see the word willing, we see the word embrace, and we see the word discomfort. And so this article really is not just about offering a challenge, but it's offering an opportunity for us to deeply engage with ourselves and also to challenge these norms. So again, back toward the beginning of the article, here's the model that we created as a diversity as an ethos. And in this wheel, and there's none in any particular order, we offer this utilization of anti-racism and its approach. But I like to start with reflection on the structural barriers and these institutional norms. And whatever way you decide to go left or right is not necessarily about a hierarchy here, but it's about being centered in that anti-racism approach as it centers all isms in your team, on your team, or throughout your groups, and being intentional about cultivating these environments that produce, a willingness for us all to embrace the challenges that we face as a group. It also requires a reckoning, being strategic with the reckoning to also kind of value that not just some things need to be changed, but a lot of things need to be changed if we are to do next level type of science that is highly innovative. It also requires interrogation of what historically has happened, and to be deeply introspective about how these social climates impact our own lived experiences. So a part of the article, and I'll just say this quote as I get ready for the reflection and the questions toward the end, that the cultivation and adoption of diversity as an ethos requires us to shift. I love the word shift. I think it is like one of the most sexy words of the dictionary. Requires shifting our focus to being intentional about an institution's character, culture, and climate. And one way for this ethos to be sustained is by facilitating an intentional anti-racism approach within the field. And the word sustained has a lot to do with how we incorporate this as an ongoing process. So I'll offer some reflection questions that can be rhetorical, or we can discuss them as a group here, conversation format. These questions are not necessarily, they're not a part of the questions you saw. So this is, it's like a pop quiz. But these questions are actually in the article. And so, for example, can members of your team talk about their identities and how these identities impact their research productivity, research processes, and experiences on a research team? And more importantly, if and when racial minorities talk about their experiences when navigating the scientific enterprise, are they heard? Are they heard? Do we actively hear? And part of yoga, there's a mantra that says one cannot be heard if one is not actually seen. So if we're not hearing and holding space for persons who are impacted deeply by isms across the board, then we're actually not seeing them. And so being heard and being seen has a lot to do with being valued and what's prioritized ongoingly. So we revisit the beach, and it is a pretty place. It is beautiful. We probably all like to kind of be there right now. But we also know that this beach is a surface, and it's not the reality, it's not the ethos, but we have to challenge ourselves to increasingly go beneath the surface of the institution. So thank you. Yes, this is a picture of Rihanna. I offer this picture because one, in maternal health, I'm really fascinated about how she's doing things differently in the media with regards to maternal health and imagery. So I'm all about doing things differently in science. So thank you, and I open the floor for Q&A, questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. That was really powerful, and you gave us a lot of things to think about. I'm wondering if folks have questions or comments they'd like to start off with.
Well, there are a number of comments in the chat that, I don't know if you can see it, Alice, that people put in while you were talking. It was really, really interesting.
Yeah, maybe an invitation to anyone who put those comments in the chat to share.
I'm looking at the chat now, so maybe I can just read okay. Or if someone wants to jump out with their question, if you wrote something in the chat, feel free.
Well, I just wrote something simple that I actually really liked your yoga analogy about discomfort, because I've been to several talks that talk about you really have to deal with the discomfort of talking about anti-racism, but people often don't give a good example of other places where we deal with discomfort. So whereas many people that do fitness or other kinds of activities deal with discomfort in that. So I appreciated that analogy. I did have a question I had when I read the article, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely.
That Vance himself, the PI, obviously, I believe, self-reports as African-American, and members of the group do. And in reading the article, I was wondering, how well does some of the reflection and things work when it may be a single student, right, who is from an underrepresented group? And I had a little bit of, I could sort of imagine you folks all sitting around the table. I had a little bit of a harder time trying to translate that into groups where I've, talked with students where they're the only person in the lab who's non-white or that kind of thing.
Yes, that's a really, really good question. Thank you so much. So just drawing from my own experiences and maybe a lot of experiences of other minoritized persons on this call, moving in and out of spaces where we're the only one is almost it's like a norm. I don't call it a norm, but it's almost like what you call this W.E.B. Du Bois says this a double consciousness experience, and so for me, I've been in spaces where, yes, I've been the only one, and I'm sure people have on this call where you're the only woman or the only, person of color, et cetera. But then you also know what it feels like to not be the only one where you have other colleagues of your same, ethnicity or same ism, et cetera, whatever. But to keep in mind that these experiences, even on groups that have similar identities, that's not the norm either. We still operate in fundamentally white institutions, and we all come from various different social identities on Blackness or otherness. So even though we might have a lived experience that is shared or similar, we're not the same. And I think being able to hold space and recognize that there's a variance in the Black experience, that we may be both Black women, but we're not the same, or we may have a similar shared experience, but being able to interrogate and hold space for my own lived experience allows me to embrace another, even if we have a similarity. So maybe some others on this call can jump in on what it's like for them having to have been an only one at some point or not have been an only one. But how do you see yourself? How have others seen you that's challenged how you show up in your research? Or you can feel free to, jump in.
Alice, it looked like Carlos had used the hand up thing.
Oh, yes, Carlos.
I have a different question, actually. So I want to make sure for that comment. So I'll take my turn after that.
Okay. And that question can largely be rhetorical. So just because we don't have an answer, sometimes it's okay. One thing I do try to, I guess, drawn from yoga again, is a lot of times, especially in Western societies, people are so used to rushing toward a solution. And with dealing with these difficult conversations, dealing with difficult discussions, sometimes it's just okay to just not have a right away answer, but to just deal with the question, to really listen and hear and acknowledge the question. I've taught Sociology 101 and social research methods to mostly pre-med students at University of Miami. And across those, semesters of teaching over 150 students, these are very difficult concepts, very difficult conversations to have. And my challenge about embracing these topics sometimes is, let's just think about the question for a moment. And oftentimes we're not really fully embracing the research process because we're stuck with trying to rush toward a solution right away that might, do more harm if we're not fully embracing the question or trying to rewrite new ones. So, yes, Carlos.
So first, I just want to echo and thank you for the incredible discussion and for the article. I wanted to just reflect on a couple of things. I'm also from Miami. I'm actually in Miami right now.
Really? What part?
So I actually teach. I'm normally in Hialeah, so I now run a biobank in Hialeah. But I get the privilege of teaching kids from Miami-Dade and University of Miami and FIU, and I just got back from Mexico, and the what I wanted to reflect a little bit on. But first of all, your notion of the beach, I love that. But not everyone goes to the same beach, number one. And especially if you go to Miami, there are beaches that different people feel comfortable at, number one, and feel welcome at, number two. And the real issue is the role that class broadly plays as a concept in all this, and especially class and research. So as I got back from Mexico, I got to visit the Tec de Monterrey, which is an incredible place. It's like just an incredible institution. And but just how much class plays as you go up and up and up and up. And that's also true in this country. and the opportunities that are afforded to us, based on class and how much that's tied to also to race. So I was curious as to how you see those kind of intersecting and the role that eventually that could play in moving us, beyond, because I think so much of this has to do with where people feel comfortable, where they feel welcome, where they see themselves being able to participate. And I see it even as I recruit kids from Dade. They're working in the biobank. They're helping me get, folks into a study. I recruit kids from FIU. They feel comfortable as data scientists crunching on the numbers. I recruit kids from UM. They're happy to be kind of like the managers. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's really just absolutely unbelievable. And and of course at Stanford, they all think they're going to be venture capitalists. So I mean, it's just absolutely wild. That from an early age, even at like 19 and 20, you're already completely kind of rolled into these positions, even within the hierarchies that you might play in science today. So anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and how you're seeing that playing out as people come into a lab, as that intersects with, race and ethnicity and ways of self realization and self-representation.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for sharing your sentiments and your comments. One thing that comes to mind is retention. And in the workforce where a lot of us are really dealing with numbers of retention rates, dropout rates, or people dropping from certain parts of the pipeline. This has a lot to do with how institutions respond to discomfort or ignore it altogether. And so what happens is when we talk about retention, we cannot ignore ethos. The ethos is persistent and it is there regardless of whether it's a positive or a negative. It's the ethos of that department or ethos of the institution, and it's a direct reflection of who's leaving the pipeline and where. For example, there have been studies on, let's say certain minoritized groups dropping out of pipeline around comps or qualifier exams, right? And they say, oh, so-and-so left the lab. And when this is circulated, how are we talking about how this person left the lab? Why did they leave the lab? What happened along the way? They didn't just decide to leave the lab that day. They didn't decide to just drop out the pipeline at that moment. This has been ongoing. What has happened that has allowed this student to drop out of the pipeline at this particular time? And how did we not see the flags or the signs along the way? What have we largely ignored? How many times have the student tried to book a meeting and the meeting was changed or rescheduled, or they weren't invited to the lab talk, or they weren't acknowledged in the classroom when they raised their hand? We don't know their name. We don't acknowledge their pronouns. We don't cite authors who maybe look like them on the syllabus, or along the way. All of that collection of an ethos does impact how that student lives and experiences the lab culture at the granular level. So when we say this student dropped the lab, are we talking about are we blaming the student, or are we really pausing to reflect on the ethos of the institution and the department? This is not about, just a one-time thing. This is a pattern that we have to acknowledge and hold space for, and really understand that to deal with these numbers and to deal with these realities is ugly. It's ugly and it's uncomfortable for a lot of people involved. And it's painful, even for a lot of scientists of color who over time have hid these realities because they just want to get through the day, or they just want to get through, a publication or finally submit their grant. They don't want to have to deal with the microaggressive behavior they had in the coffee room. So when we talk about these patterns and we talk about things like retention, this is deliberately knowing that we have a hand in how someone experiences the culture of the lab or the group as well.
I mean, I'll add one comment, which is, I hadn't really even appreciated like the importance of public transportation, right? So I had somebody come in to come do an internship with me, and I'd invited a bunch of people to show up, and they showed up 12 minutes late. And it's because they had to take 3 buses to get here. And they were on a bus for 2.5 hours, right? And so you say, okay, geez Louise, right? And we'd of course going to pay everybody to do their internship, right? And so, you know, you don't even think about stuff like that when you're used to places where everybody's like a residential student, right? You know, and so that role of like, how do you even begin to get people in who might imagine themselves in being able to do research, you know, completely. And then, you know, and in New York, it's a totally different issue. In San Francisco, you tend to think about having reasonable public transportation. You know, Miami's a completely different town when it comes to that issue. So, and it obviously intersects with race, right? Like it's not random where you've got good buses and bad buses, right? And the buses go in certain ways and not in other ways. So anyway, just wanted to kind of raise that issue and thank you again, because we don't normally think of them, you know, from the other side of how we set this up, even if we're trying to ourselves make opportunities available to people.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you so much. And yes, Claudia, you got your hand raised.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for this amazing talk, and especially for putting into words a lot of the issues and the thoughts I think that many of us have had, especially in the last 2 years. I like especially the part where you say about the ethos of our institution, right? It's more than just numbers, and that really resonated because like I was in an institution previously that when all of these D&I efforts started, some of the conversation was like, so how many people do we need to hire now? Like, do we need to be equivalent to the US Census so that we are okay in terms of D&I? And it's completely missing the point, right? It's, as you say, it's the culture, right? And it's a process, and it's the lack of a voice that has been given over years to people that are already there, right? That's not going to change with suddenly hiring a percentage of people that it's reflective of the US Census, or this tokenism, right? Like, oh, we'll have a few people from these or that ancestries and then call it diversity. That's not the point, right? Giving people a seat at the table, a voice, it's what's relevant, right? And then that by itself will help increase diversity and make the place a better inclusive place to be at. So just that comment, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you so much for your comments. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I see we're fired up with some questions here in the chat group, but feel free to jump in there. I see Laura raised her hand. Feel free to jump in with a question or comment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like that talk was poetry and my question is very much prose, but there's a lot of people on this call that might be helpful to this. I work at a genetic counseling training program, and we have put in an enormous amount of efforts over many, many years to try and bring more diversity into the field, so that, both for the quality of what happens in our program, having more voices, but also for the field, right? Like genetic counseling desperately needs more diversity. And I'm concerned about the legal challenges of the Supreme Court case that's very likely to make affirmative action illegal. And I honestly don't know what pieces of what we currently do. I mean, some of it they can't get at. Some of it has just been like the points you're making about going deep down and sort of finding the obstacles and not just saying we're gonna, give extra points because you're Hispanic or you're Black or whatever, though we do that too, right? Like, but just sort of looking deeper, and they can't get at that. But still, I don't know, maybe there's some of you, looking at you, Mildred, people that like this talk or other talks, and bring in some legal people to talk about like what is likely to be illegal and how we can maybe rename some of what we do, refocus what we can do to not come afoul of that. I'm just really worried about those changes. Do you want to say anything about that, and how they're going to undermine our abilities to our efforts so far?
Absolutely. So one thing that comes to mind is policy here, right? And a lot of policy formation and policy development is informed by what's happening at the granular level, the micro level, the personal level. So the socio-ecological model is integrated. The micro level is impacted by what happens at the macro level at the top. These structures impact how we all see ourselves, how we experience and navigate. And policies are formed that impact how people live their lives. These are life and death situations for a lot of people based on a policy that they might not have been in the room to refute or to accept. So when we talk about the legal aspects, we have to remember that policy is determined, is often by how introspective are these policymakers or scientists or scholars, even when they're in the room. What does this research process look like? So if we're not even getting at the heartbeat or that perception level of who we are as scholars or as scientists, the work and the research that we produce that is being cited by policymakers can't even begin to push the change forward. So these processes are not separate, they're a collection. And so I agree with you, absolutely. But we do need to have all hands on deck here. And this is why I enjoy studying, team science or more interdisciplinary type of science, because everyone has different perceptions and perspectives of, let's say, genetics or precision medicine from various different platforms, sociology, legal scholars, et cetera. But we all have to still do the introspective work in order to produce research that can impact the policies that will impact people's lived experiences. That's my quick take, but if someone else wants to jump in there, feel free. Yes. And we have Vince here.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Vince's, because I was just going to say the training grant descriptions from NIH heavily emphasize the importance of diversity. And I don't know what's going to happen with that, depending on how the Supreme Court rules.
So the one comment I wanted to make, and thank you, Dr. Thomas, for that great talk, is that Dr. Thomas's message was not about the numbers. And it was not about who you bring into your lab. It's about the environment that you have and creating an environment that people are welcome, that their voice is heard, that they participate, and those kinds of things that the United States Supreme Court doesn't impact. And so I think that's the question and the challenge to each of us is your lab or your program welcoming? Are the individuals there? Are they provided an opportunity to provide voice and perspective? And are they limited in any kind of way? Now, that doesn't mean that there's not, potential clouds on the horizon, but that wasn't the message today. And I think that's the frame that we control. So thinking about my own lab, thinking about, how do I make sure, as I think about the kind of individuals I'm interested in, that is going to make my lab stronger, and what are things that I need to move forward the work that we're doing and training, that has nothing to do about selection of an individual based on race or ethnicity or gender. So those are my comments.
Thank you so much, Vince. That was a beautiful way, I think, to end, since we are at time. Just a reminder of the frame and the message. And, Dr. Thomas, if you have any last words you want to share with us before we go.
Yes, thank you all for this beautiful opportunity. And I just encourage you all to share this and also use those questions ongoingly and maybe come up with some of your own to contribute to in your own labs and groups as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.